So we are continuing our new sermon series, and last week we began it talking about the idea of gospel or good news. And just a reminder that if you happen to miss a week, there's a couple of ways that you can catch up, or if you're out of town or something. The first one is, of course, YouTube, which many of us have joined in on at some point, and that includes the whole worship service. We also have a podcast that is just the sermons, and I say podcast, that's how it streams, but it's just my sermon. It's not a conversation or anything different. But if you have podcast software on your phone, like Spotify or iTunes or whatever, then you can just set it up so that the sermons just download automatically, and you stay in touch that way. So the link for the podcast is on the website, and that's the easiest way to direct you. So today I want to talk about creation. If you heard on the way in, you were met at the door and told that we were going to be talking, or I was going to be talking about creation today, I'm guessing that most of us would then say, oh, we're expecting a presentation about creation or 7-day creation versus evolution. And that's usually the way this topic is addressed. And I find those scientific conversations to be interesting. Okay, there's a lot of information that can be learnt from those kind of conversations. I know some of us have visited the Creation Museum and the Big Ark exhibit down in Kentucky. And from all reports, I haven't been there, but everybody that has says that they're fascinating, right? Fascinating experiences. Well, I'm going to talk about creation today, but I want to do so without talking about evolution. Okay? I know, put your seatbelts on, it's a little unusual. Because while I appreciate the debate between these two views of origins, I don't believe that the Bible should be treated as a scientific textbook. Okay? The purpose of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is not to give us material to have an argument about the methodology of creation. Rather, the goal is to establish Yahweh as the creator and as the ultimate source of everything. So where did everything come from? Okay? There's a lot of stuff in the universe. Some of it we can see, some of it we get told is there's as much or more dark matter out there in the universe as there is light matter, So I don't even really know what that means, but apparently it's out there, right? Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. There's a lot of stuff in the universe. And so where did it all come from? We could travel around the world and visit a lot of different cultures and would find a lot of different creation stories if we did that. In the ancient cultures that were contemporary with Israel, the creation stories usually involve tales of different gods, either making love or making war. And as a result of one of those, everything came into existence. Okay? And once that was brought in, everything was brought into existence, then it was the role of the humans to serve the whims of the gods. And if the humans couldn't make the gods happy, there were consequences. In contrast, the Israelite creation story contains only one God. Okay? contains only one God. There's no sort of love-making. There's no war that takes place between the gods. There's just a God. No motivation for creation is given. It's not explained or spelled out there in Genesis. It's just God is doing this thing. What's interesting, though, is that we see that the way that it is described places humanity at the apex of creation. The rest of the world, the environment, everything is put in place and prepared for the creation of humanity. And what do we say? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And so there's always, I think, then some humans that go, hey, we're the apex creature. Until we're face to face with a grizzly bear. But, we're the apex creature. And therefore, the only thing that matters is our welfare, and we'll do whatever needs to be done to ensure that. And so, I think one of the things we need to notice is, in the Scripture account of creation, is just because humans are placed at the apex, we're also given the responsibility to care for creation. Okay? And then the fourth thing to note that is different from other accounts is that humans are not created to serve God, but to relate to God. Okay? So humans weren't created in the very beginning to meet a need of God. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. Okay? Weren't created to meet a need of God. Rather, they were created to enjoy relationship with God. And we see that as God walks with them, apparently as a frequent habit, walks with the first man and woman in the cool of the day inside the Garden of Eden. God did not create and step away and watch as a science experiment. He said, no, I want to get to know you. I want you to get to know me. Genesis chapter 1 describes the act of God as act of creation as God simply speaking into the void, and different parts of creation instantly appearing. It emphasizes the power of God, that he could do that. Who else could possibly accomplish this? And I think that is oftentimes when we talk about creation and we say, what does it tell us about God? I think the first thing that comes to mind, at least for me, is power. Okay? That he could speak. Didn't even need to snap his fingers, right? He could speak, and it wasn't just that people or other beings did what he told them to do, but it just happened. But then we come to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 also tells the story of creation, or retells the story, and we see a different portrayal of God's character. In Genesis chapter 2, God rolls up his sleeves and gets dirty. Okay? He forms man from the dust of the ground. He doesn't just speak and humanity appears. He takes his time and forms man from the dust. He breathes life, gets down and puts his face in the dust and breathes into the nostrils the breath of life. And so, even though we have this creation account that emphasizes the power of God, we also have this creation account that emphasizes the closeness, the intimacy of God with his creation. And so together, these two stories describe God's power, and the universe can just exist because he speaks, but it also describes how he's personally involved, invested in his creation. mostly though, the stories of creation communicate that God is the creator. Okay? God is the ultimate source of everything. And we would also add, there is no source to God. Even today, though, this is the most difficult question for science to answer. Because you sort of keep going back. You say, okay, there was a Big Bang. Well, where'd the Big Bang come from? Well, it came from this. Where'd that come from? Well, it came from that. Well, where'd that come? And so it sort of just keeps on going. And we say, well, where did that come from? And so there is no scientific answer to that. How could something come from nothing? That's really the question. How could something come from nothing? And how can you ever develop an experiment to demonstrate that something can come from nothing? So it's a sort of just out there, hanging over this question that hangs over all scientific work that's done in discussing origins. And so as Christians, we believe, we're not ever told the details. Even when God speaks, right? We understand that if God speaks something into existence, that there are still molecules and atoms and things that have to move and that appear and that do stuff. And I don't know how that happens when God just speaks and it happens, right? I don't know what the science is, if that's how it worked. There are lots of people that believe that God took his time, that the 7 days in Genesis are symbolic or eras, however you want to phrase that, and that God took his time on all of that. Okay, and so there's lots of different ideas about how it worked, and those details of how aren't explained. But we can be convinced that God is the ultimate source of everything. Okay, so where are we going with this, Peter? If you were here last week, in fact, I said at the beginning, right, this is a series about the gospel, a series about good news. And here I am jumping into a debate that's been around for 100 plus years, right, with Charles Darwin. So you're right, if that's what you're thinking. This is our sermon series, right? Taken from the words of the angels at the birth of Jesus. Good news causing great joy for all people. I want to put this set of symbols up on the screen, and perhaps you've seen this before, and even if you haven't, maybe you can make sense of it. You can decipher how it relates to the gospel message. Jesus comes down to earth. Jesus is crucified. The tomb is empty as Jesus is resurrected. He returns to the throne of God, and one day he's coming back. Okay? And so it's a very simple explanation of the life of Jesus. It's become a popular way to share the story of Jesus' life. I have friends who've got it tattooed on their arm as a conversation starter with people that they might run into. But if you'll look closely at this, you'll notice that it doesn't tell the whole gospel. Because it doesn't really start at the beginning. Creation is the beginning of the gospel, the beginning of God's good news. And so while we might turn to the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament, and it looks something like this, he opens up with introducing John the Baptizer, and then next thing you know, here's this guy Jesus getting baptized, right? And we're boom, straight into the story. That's kind of how Mark writes. A lot of action. Keep it moving. Okay. But all of the other three Gospels all begin earlier than that. For them, their telling of the good news of Jesus doesn't begin with Jesus as an adult. It begins not even with Jesus' birth, although that may be the first words in the gospel, but ultimately they trace the origin of the good news back much earlier. We could go to the Matthew's gospel. And Matthew begins with this list, not of anything really about Jesus, but a list of people who lived between Abraham and Jesus. And it says, here's how we got from point A, Abraham, to point J, Jesus. Okay? And it traces this lineage all the way down. But if we were to go to Luke's gospel, Luke actually begins just telling the story of Jesus' birth, but after a while he comes back and he says, but I want to tell you who this Jesus is. He was the son. And he begins a long list of different people that he was the son of, who was the son of, who was the son of. Ultimately, though, he was the son of Adam, who was the son of God. Okay? So we have this, for Luke, he says the good news begins with God, begins with creation, begins with Adam, and that's where things start. And ultimately it leads to this day and this time, that is Jesus and the ministry of Jesus. So that's Luke and how he begins the gospel message. If we were to go to John, John is very similar. In fact, John's first verse of John is basically a takeoff of the first verse of Genesis. Right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Genesis, in the beginning, is the same words of Genesis chapter 1. God created the heaven and the earth. Okay? And so we have John, when he writes his gospel, it says, I'll tell you where the gospel begins. It begins in the beginning. If you're a fan of the Sound of Music, you know that's true, right? Okay? We start at the very good beginning, a very good place to start. And so John is of that philosophical school. He says, well, we'll start at the beginning. At the beginning, God. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, the Word was God. Through him all things were made. The Word, which is a description of Jesus. Jesus was not just a spectator at creation. Even though his name doesn't appear in Genesis, he wasn't just a spectator at creation. Rather, through him all things were made. He was actively involved in the creative process. Nothing was made without him. Nothing was made that has been made. When we look at the first sermons from the church after the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, I think that we might expect them all to focus very much on that diagram in the middle there, right? The death, burial, the resurrection of Jesus leading to the baptism of the listeners. Perhaps, surprisingly, what we find as we look at the sermons, in the New Testament, mostly in the book of Acts, is that the way they're presented and the points that they emphasize very much depends on who the audience is. Okay? So there is not just this one formula that the apostles or whoever it is that's preaching just says, okay, look, here's my gospel tract, one size fits all. I'm just going to give it to all of you, okay, and we'll letterbox the whole city, and you all get the same gospel message and presentation, and you should all respond in the same way. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but people aren't all the same. Right? And so when we just say, okay, I'm going to talk in one particular way to everybody, we're not going to connect with everybody. We need to be a little more sensitive to what's going on around us and in people's lives. So I want you to look at these two examples again up on the screen. Here we first of all we have the Apostle Peter at Pentecost on the left side there. And Peter at Pentecost in his sermon, he says, I want to draw your attention to the way that prophecy is now being fulfilled. Okay? In verse 16 of Acts chapter 2, as Peter begins his sermon, he says, no. Right? This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. Right? His very first line is that this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Crazy thing is that the people there would have known what he was talking about. What if I said that to you? Today's sermon is all about the fulfillment of the prophecy in Joel. You go, what is Peter going to be talking about today? Right? How many prophecies do you know in Joel? That wouldn't be a good way for me to open the sermon, to introduce the topic. But the Apostle Peter on the day of Pentecost, he was talking to Jews. He could do that. He could say, hey, you guys know what Joel talked about. Well, now it's happening. You're seeing what you've heard for so long. The next thing he wants to establish with them is that Jesus is the Messiah. Okay? Again, maybe not a big deal for us. Right? We were raised on stories of Superman and Spider-Man, not on stories of a Messiah. But for this Jewish audience, there was this sort of hope of a Messiah who would change the world, make life better for them. And then Peter says, you crucified him. How many people could a sermon like that be preached to? You crucified him. We might say, oh, well, symbolically it was our sins that he died. Yeah, I get all that. But we weren't the ones there in the court of the Roman governor yelling out, crucify him. Okay? And so that accusation of you crucified him could only be made to those people who were there in that city at that time. And then, of course, because having established that God is at work in this fulfilling prophecy, this person was the Messiah, you killed him, you need forgiveness. Right? I mean, that's a pretty convicting set of arguments. That if Jesus is the Messiah and you killed him, like all of history's been working, been building up to this moment. The hope of Israel has been put on his shoulders. We've been looking forward with expectation for him, and you killed him. Right? And so, of course, now you're going to say you need forgiveness. And for those people that accept that message, that accept that Jesus was the Messiah, that accept that prophecy is being fulfilled, they're saying, we need forgiveness. How do we get out of this mess? Right? And so it's a great sermon, and it's right where it hits them right between the eyes with what they needed to hear, what was relevant to them. But then when we come over to when Paul arrives in the city of Lystra, this is in Acts chapter 14. And he comes in, he and I think who is it, Barnabas? They come to Lystra and they heal somebody. They in verse 9 of chapter 14, there was a lame man. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw he had faith to be healed, and called out, stand up on your feet. And at that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw Paul, what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. So because of what God is able to do through Paul in healing this lame man, they have the attention of the city. People are wanting to worship them as gods. Paul Well, in verse 14, when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes, rushed into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you gospel. We are bringing you good news." What is that good news? "Telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them." That's the good news. That we can introduce you to the living God who made everything. That's the good news. You're like, hang on, what about Jesus? What about dying on the cross? What about forgiveness of sins? No, he says, because they're beginning to tell the gospel story. And for these people who don't know who Yahweh is, don't know who the God of the Israelites is, they have to say, we're going to start at the very beginning. And we want to introduce you to God. And this is who God is. He is the creator. He is the one who got everything started. And look around at your creation. And let me point out something. Paul says, God has not left himself, in verse 17, without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven, crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. God shows mercy. He gives rain to these people that don't worship him. He provides food and he provides joy to these people there in Lystra. And so Paul's gospel presentation here is very different from what we might expect. So if I, again, walk into a church today and I say, I want to convince you who God is, that wouldn't be a great place to start, right? Because there's a good chance you're already here because you're open to the concept of there being a God. There's a good chance you already know something about the Christian God and the beliefs of who he is. You may or may not have a correct impression and understanding, but you still acknowledge, his existence. And so it's not like I want to introduce you. But there would be other places in the city where perhaps we're going to say, look, you need to know who God is. Right? Because there are people and communities and family groups that have no connection with God at all. And so the gospel begins at a different place. It's hard to begin the gospel with Jesus when you don't know who God is. Why do I need forgiveness? Well, because you've sinned against God. Who's God? Well, let me tell you who God is. God is the creator. God is the one who made this world. And if you want to live in this world, if you want to live in harmony, if you want to succeed, if you want to sort of live in sync with the way the world is designed to be lived, if you want to live in sync with the Creator, then you need to know the Creator and how He wants us to behave, to live in this world. What's His goal, His purpose for us? And so what we talk about to different people varies depending on who we're talking to. So where's the good news of creation? I've got a couple of ideas here for you. I think the first good news about creation is that God hasn't finished creating. So I know that the right God rests on the seventh day, right? It says, I'm done. It's all good. But what was it that caught the attention of the city in Lystra? It was the healing of somebody who was lame. In a sense, it is the restoring back to the way creation was supposed to be. I don't know why the person was lame, if they were born that way, if they'd been dropped as a baby, been in a car accident, whatever it might be. Paul arrives and restores his his strength, okay, so that he is able to walk. He creates, in a sense, strength where there wasn't any. Jesus' ministry is so much like that. When we look at the miracles that Jesus performs throughout his ministry, his healing, his bringing back to life, his controlling of nature, whether it be reproducing food in a supernatural way or calming storms, everything that he is doing there are acts of recreation, taking what is broken and restoring it. And so we see this happening in Jesus' ministry in a physical sense. But we also receive creation in a non-physical sense. What's wrong can be made right, not just in the world, but in us. Because Creator God isn't finished creating. He's also the re-creator. So there's a couple of verses there. If anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. Or the new creature, but I think creation's a better word there, has come. The old has gone. The new is here. Okay, there's a new creative work that takes place when we give our lives to Jesus. Jesus is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Right? So creation wasn't God just stepping away. God is continuing to be involved and holding things together, keeping them running. And so God hasn't finished with creation. That's good news, right? That's good news, because otherwise we're just going to say, oh, the way things are is just the way things are, and it's, it's terrible, and it's broken, and it's hurt, and it's harmful, and there's all these things that are just, I don't like. And the good news is that God hasn't finished, that God is still involved and still engaged in his creation. The second piece of good news is that we also get to participate in God's recreation. Okay? So first, we ourselves are renewed, as we just saw. Then we share that renewal with our neighbors. You see, our mission as Christians, as people of God, as residents of the kingdom of God, isn't to sit back and watch the world burn. Right? That's not our job. Our job is to be involved in the recreation process and to bring God's presence to those around us. Genesis chapter 1. Adam and Eve weren't just placed in the garden to enjoy it and to frolic the whole time. Work was part of the original design. Fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, every living creature that moves on the ground, in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, Lord God took man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. That's before the curse. And some of us think, oh yeah, the Garden of Eden, it's just like eternal playtime. But there was work. Work is a good thing. And so here it's the taking care of creation, taking care of the animals, taking care of what's around us. And so we are part of God's recreation as well. That we contribute both to the care of our planet as representatives of God, but also as Peter did in Lystra, as Paul did in Lystra, of telling people about the God, the Creator. And so that's, I think, good news. And then the third one is because God is a creator, we have some things. You see, creation wasn't just about physical stuff, right? God didn't just create physical stuff and then say, all right, you guys figure it out. You work out what's good and what's bad. You work out, Rather, God gave, there in Genesis, he gave people purpose. Matthew 5:45 says that God sends rain on the just and the unjust. Right? He demonstrates grace through creation, that we all get to experience creation. God also gives value to people. He says, yeah, there's a purpose for you here. And he gives identity. Because he says, Genesis 1:26, you're made in the image of God. Right? Made in the image of God, the likeness of God. That there are traits and there are attributes that we absorb as people from God. I think this is perhaps the most important part of the good news of creation, is that we're not just drifting through life, but that God created and intends for us to have purpose because he sees us as having value and he wants us to have identity. And he shows grace to all of us in the meantime. You see, when people feel they have no value, forgiveness isn't their greatest need. When people feel they have no value, forgiveness isn't their greatest need. The people of Pentecost, their greatest need at that moment in time was mercy and forgiveness. They were just realizing they'd made a big mistake. Okay. But sometimes people first need to know that they're not an accident. They need to know that they're valued, that they can contribute. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. A lot of translations use the phrase here, handiwork. We are God's handiwork. But the word has a little bit more significance to it than that. It's really saying we are God's work of art. Okay? And yes, Paul's writing this to a church and he talks about we, he's perhaps talking about the church as a whole, but individually we're part of that. You are God's work of art. So I think even that idea of handiwork, it's not my favorite word, but it takes my mind back to the Garden of Eden. It takes my mind back to God rolling up his sleeves and forming a person out of the dust. And so many of us, we think, oh, I don't have any value, I'm not worth anything, I don't know why I'm here, I can't do anything right, I'm just a mistake, I just mess up all the time. You know, I don't know what my value is. And we're reminded here, you are God's handiwork. God, I don't understand the biology, but God says, no, I would get my hands dirty, and I would mold you, and I would make you just the way you are. You are my masterpiece. And he has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. You see, God gives us, the Creator God creates us with a purpose. He creates us with a value. He gives us an identity. And he extends grace to all of us. I want to encourage you today that if you need God's grace in your life, please talk to me afterwards. Talk to somebody else. If you want to make a commitment to follow Jesus, if you want to respond like the people did at Pentecost and be baptized, if you want to explore these topics further, however God may be working in your life today, I want to encourage you, talk to somebody before you leave here. Because I believe it's important. Because God has given us a purpose, a value, identity, and always his grace.